Good morning. So I have to start with this. This has been a long, it's been a long time in wandering back and forth. My wife is very nervous that there's just like, you just don't read the room. No, you don't understand Americans. They won't think it's funny. I'm like, it's a blue coat, not a red coat. It'll be fine. And it's rumbled on. So what I decided to do was to take the costume, which I actually own. I know that sounds odd, but I do because of the book. And so I took the costume just transatlantic, put it in the suitcase, and I've had a lot of fun debating whether or not to do it. And basically my sensible friends all said, no, no, no. And my fun friends all said, yes, yes, yes. And in the end, including, I think Sam Storms is sitting back there, and he was very mischievously going, are you going to wear the thing? Are you going to wear the thing? And then John Piper arrives during the dinner, and he goes, oh, this is a bad idea. This is going to be bad. And so I don't know. We're just going to have to wait and see. But I thought it would be fun. So anyway, it is a great privilege to be speaking to you on the bounce as well. 2 sessions in a row. You've gluttons for punishment for English accents and that sort of thing. But what I'm going to try and do is I want to set up a little bit what the book is. It'd help me even for some context. Has anyone in here already read it? So anybody knows what it is? Okay, so about 3. That's great. So no, but that's really good because what you don't want to do is then tell people about something that they go, yeah, we know. So that's very helpful. The 3 of you might be going, wow, I've been here before, but that's okay. One of them's Bob, so we're going to be fine. And then what I'm going to try and do is sort of summarize the argument of the whole book in one page, which I will put up on the screen in a moment. So one screenshot. I used to be a management consultant, which means that you basically go into companies and ask them questions, they go away, turn it into a page, that sort of a clever graphic, and then return and give it to them, and they go, wow, this is amazing, here's £100,000. So that's a little bit what I'm hoping will happen. So I'm going to summarize the book. And so I'll summarize the book. And then what I want to lead into, I think, in our time together, is to have plenty of opportunity for questions, and also to give a bit of a thought to, particularly towards the end of the book, where I try and talk about how we respond in our post-Christian moment, which I think for most of us is probably the cash value of the idea. I hope it's interesting. I hope people having come to this would think, oh, that's a good book, I'd like to read it. But even if you don't, I'd want you to feel equipped, at least to some degree, as to how we engage with the post-Christian world. And it's something, obviously, I've just written this book about. And then I think they introduced the podcast, didn't they, while I was backstage, the Post-Christianity podcast that Glenn and I have done, which is another attempt to do this. So some of you go, do you know what, that book is probably not for me, but either the podcast or even what we talk about today may help. And then we'll have hopefully lots of time for Q&A, which mic stands will appear somewhere, and it'll be fine. Okay? So that's where we're going. As Todd said in his kind introduction, there's the conceit of the book is, in a way, that 2 things, really. It's the idea that the world we live in now is well summed up by being the acronym WEIRD, which stands for Western, Educated, Industrialized, Rich, Democratic, Ex-Christian, and Romantic. And that those 7 features of our world, much of which I've borrowed from psychologists who've done work on Western people and how different we are to, I say we, some of you are probably not Western, but most of us are, and how different we are from everyone else. That 1 billion of the world's people think in this way, and about 7 billion of the world's people think very differently about power, family, diet, taboos, sex, work, the economy, politics, very different, which anyone who's ever been to another country will know, but actually to understand why we are as we are, and therefore how those of us who are, I think in many ways all of us, as missionaries to a increasingly post-Christian culture, how we should understand that world, and then what we can do about it. So the first conceit of the book is that WEIRDER sums up our modern world. That's half of it. But the reason I'm wearing this, and the reason why the number 1776 is on the front cover, is because the other part of the book, and in fact more of it in terms of the story, is that those 7 things are true because of things, and in ways that can be very well explained by things that occurred in 1776. And so one of the first things I have to do when talking to my American friends about this book, and every time this has happened, someone say, why is a British person blaming American independence for post-Christianity? I'm like, that's honestly not what I'm doing, although the mischievous subtitlers at Crossway have clearly tried to imply I am. But what I'm actually doing is to say, no, that is one of the 7 transformations taking place in this extraordinary year. And it's the one that probably most of us in the room are very familiar with, for most people. I'm not American. That's the chapter I found the hardest to write because I didn't know anything about it. I was like, okay, I'd heard of Adams, Franklin, Jefferson, Washington, but if you'd asked me, so who's Benjamin Rush and who's John Hancock? I'd be like, is he the guy with the big signature? But that's all I knew. I don't know anything about it. So actually for me, that was a small slice. That of those 7 transformations, W-E-I-R-D, democratic, that's very the American Revolution is really key to the democratic story. And so I go a lot into it in that chapter. But all the others, the developments and transformations taking place that make the world today have very little to do with what's happening in North America. And shock horror, have things to do with other parts of the world which also lived through this year and most of them didn't know what was happening in North America. And they are connected, but I want to walk you through that. So this is probably a little bit of fanfare here, but so this is in one page what it's taken me, I suppose, 3 years. I've read hundreds and hundreds of books and obviously written quite a big one myself. But this is basically all that book says, and so now none of you need to buy it, and Crossway will drop me as an author on my no. I hope that this helps. But this is basically what the book is saying about 1776, and I've found when I've taught on this before, it's helped people just to see all in one place what's going on. So if you just track down the far left-hand column, you'll see the acronym WEIRDER. The first 5 of those, as I said, psychologists have used for 10 or 15 years to explore what's distinctive about Western people. That obviously they're Western, but they are almost every neighbor, everyone who lives within 10 miles of your house is, relative to most people in history, highly educated. They and you live in a very industrialized society. This room is at a very abnormal temperature. Right? If you've got 500 people in a room like this, it should be much hotter than it is, but it's cooled artificially, and everything in here, the fact you can hear me now, obviously it's all built on industrial technology, and everything about our world is shaped by that reality. And if you don't live in an industrialized society, you think very differently about lots of things. You'd think very differently because you're rich, which as North America, I imagine, maybe per capita not quite, but economically by far the richest nation on earth. You are, and I am, democratic in our thinking, which does not just mean that we vote once every 2 years or every 4 years for our representatives, but it also means that you and I almost, this might be too strong, but we almost fetishize choice. That we would say, actually, my capacity to choose, not just my government, but everything, is one of the most fundamental things about me. And that is partly baked into the political system your nation has, and mine does, but it's baked into many other aspects of ordinary life that make Western people fundamentally choosers, people who pick. And obviously that is, if you bundle together I, R, and D, you get consumerism. Because you have industrial possibilities, you have sufficient affluence, and you also have a mindset of choice, which means that people are by and large, driven and able to make choices about everything, including, as their breakfast cereal, their marriage partner. Most people in history have not particularly thought that what you do is you survey the world and consider which of these people might I like to marry. That's just not how most cultures do marriage. It's not how any culture in the Bible does marriage. But we would just almost find it abhorrent, many of us, to think an arranged marriage. You think, well, that's what most people do. And those sorts of things. So because we're democratic, it's very baked into us. It's not just, we have, founding fathers on our banknotes and we have an election. Democracy runs deeper than that in our thinking. And then the bottom 2 are what I've added to the acronym. So weird, some of you may have read Joseph Henrich, Jonathan Haidt, people like that who make a lot of the idea of us being weird. And I've added 2 at the end, that we are also, in that sense, ex-Christian and romantic, which means they're more to do with the ideas and the ideals that drive people, rather than the top 5, which are more to do with their economic and political and social circumstances. But when you step from the circumstances to the ideas that drive people, actually post-Christianity, by which I don't mean no one's Christian anymore, but I mean you can't assume Christianity, Christendom is long gone, and people have got a Christian foundation for everything they think, even though they don't realize it. Ex-Christianity. And then Romanticism, which is if those of us who have read Carl Trueman's work on either Strange New World or The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, he does a bunch of this, and what I write in that chapter tracks a bit with what he's saying, although it does it very differently. And that's the idea that this idea that the inner self gets expressed initially in art, poetry, and music, but now really in every Disney movie, in every part of your society, you think of yourself as like a romantic person does, even if you think, I don't want to believe that. In the end, it shapes us nevertheless, and it shapes our families and our kids. So that's the final section. And so those 7 words are intended to encapsulate what is distinctive about the modern world we're in, and it, I hope, gives some explanatory power, which means that when you look at your modern world, lots of these things hopefully will connect things and go, I mean, at one point I do a sort of several pages on trying to just tell you about you, and I make about over 100 generalizations about you, and my bet would be that at least 95 of them are true of everyone in this room. There might be 1 or 2 you say, oh, that's not actually for me. But these things ranging from you've never witnessed an animal sacrifice to you have done at least 1 personality test. Or lots of things like that would be true because of these 7 things, that there is a flush toilet within 60 seconds walk of where you're sitting. And that's obviously true now. I know that because I've just visited it and so have you. But that's true of almost everybody who will ever read the book I've written. And it's just that our lives are extremely unusual relative to most people in history. So the left-hand column is that first premise, which is this is the modern world. The rest of the book is then about, oh yeah, those things are true because of things that happened in 1776. And you can see the transformation, or the revolution, you might call it. I mean, depends how, patriotic we're feeling, I suppose. By the way, I'm very patriotic about being American, even though I'm not. If you could put me in a baseball game and everyone sings the national anthem, I just feel so proud to be American. Tears come to my eyes, and the Rockets. I mean, this is people blowing up me and my ancestors, but I still feel so proud to be part of it. It's always been true. It's just such a good national anthem. And we're like, boom, 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 and you guys are like, oh, it's just fantastic, very stirring. So this is this is all in love rather than, bitterness or anything like that. But the transformations or the revolutions that take place in this extraordinary year, probably one of these 7 is very familiar to you, and the other 6 maybe less so. Depends how much history you've done and all that stuff. But the top one is globalization, and this, I tell the story of the voyages of James Cook, who you may have heard of, Captain Cook, might be a familiar name, sort of man from in the northeast of England, Yorkshire, and he has sort of these great voyages which take place actually his first one starts in 1769, but he goes on 3 major voyages of exploration and discovery and ends up being killed in Hawaii, but his voyages are an extremely important step in the process of globalization. He goes out on a scientific research trip initially to sort of plot the transit of Venus, but they go out on the ship. But as they do, they discover, obviously there are lots of people already living there, but they discover countless places that had never been mapped. Many of the best maps you had for 100 years were drawn by him, who's an extraordinary character. And so his ships, the Endeavour and the Resolution, and I tell the story of those voyages and tell the story about how the fascinating thing to me is about that when he's going on these journeys, he is encountering people whose level of development or technology or wealth is dramatically different from all the people he's ever met before. And he and the people on his ship are trying to work out why that is. And there's some fascinating discussions that effectively they're having. So when we sail to the tip of South America as Europeans, why is the level of, quote, development so different here than it is where we are? And then they sail on, and they go to the South Pacific, and they meet more people. And they think, well, that's weird. These people are a lot more developed than the people in South America, but they're much less developed than in Europe. Why is that? And then they sail around Australia, and they have the first ever Western encounter with Aboriginal Australians. And they're sort of sailing up the coast, and they meet Aboriginals, and they think, now this is very unusual because these people are it would seem in some ways very similar to the Polynesians, but totally different in their levels of development and their interest in us. And they're sort of debating this thing, and there's an amazing moment where this Tahitian man who travels with them for a while on the journey encounters another Polynesian island, what we now call Easter Island. Obviously, it wasn't called that at the time. And they encounter this island, and this Tahitian man is saying, this is very, very strange because these people look just like me. They have the same practices. They do tattoos. They're very obviously connected to my people. Yet our culture in Tahiti is, or what we now think of Tahiti, is much more advanced and developed than these people, even though they're just a short boat trip away. Why is that? And this young man is called Mahine from Polynesia. He comes up with this lovely line and he just says, oh, good people, bad land. The reason these people are limited is not because they have anything to do with the people, it's because of the geography, it's with where they live, it's because of whether or not they have enough trees, whether or not they have, we would now say, navigable rivers, whether the local animals are what they are in Eurasia, pigs, sheep, cows, horses, very suitable for food, plowing, domestication, farming, clothing, or whether they're the native animals of, say, Australia. So, because what happens is Western people looked at the world around them and thought, we have more advanced than these people. That must be because we're cleverer, better, nobler. And this young man, Mahine, made this beautiful statement. It's effectively to say, no, that's not why that's true. It's true because the people are great. The people are just like you. What the different, and it's a very important comment against racism, of course. But what's different is the geography. The difference is that if you had been born, everyone in this room had been born in Australia in the 18th century, we just simply, you can't, you try getting a kangaroo to pull a plow. You know what I mean? You're farming wallabies, and it's just unthinkable. And the same is true, of course, in Southern Africa. You're going to go, even a zebra. You could try and get a zebra to do what a horse does. Ride a zebra into battle. It will not go well for you, my friend, no matter how skillful you are. And so Mahine makes this lovely comment, and that's a comment, and that chapter goes in quite a lot to globalization and why the world is connected in the way it is, and why the nations that advanced faster to a particular point are the ones that on the map where they are. And talk quite a lot about maps in that chapter and tell the story of Captain Cook. So I gave more time on that one because it wouldn't be obvious from what I said that what it was. Then the Enlightenment chapter, that's the second transformation that made us, quote, educated. I tell the story of the European Enlightenment and talk about a whole load of things happening there with the stories of the Salon in Paris where Baron d'Holbach hosts pretty much everyone you would have heard of from this period outside of North America. In fact, Ben Franklin himself went as well. The Poker Club, which sounds like a lot of fun in Scotland. The club, Samuel Johnson's club in London. And Immanuel Kant is drafting the Critique of Pure Reason in 1776. Edward Gibbon writes the history of the decline and fall of the Roman Empire in 1776. This year is not just significant in this country. It's very significant in Europe in what's happening in the Enlightenment. And I tell that story and, in a way, critique it as well. David Hume writes his dialogues concerning natural religion and then dies in 1776. So a lot of very important thinkers for the modern world. Industrialized, the Industrial Revolution, I would say the key year in the history of industrial technology is 1776. There's actually three major things happen, but the biggest one is that James Watt's steam engine, so you now measure power in watts, and so you buy a lamp or a light bulb or whatever, and it says so and so W, which stands for all of these terms come from this period. Alessandro Volta, also that's why you call them volts, and that's why you have probably a plug socket with a V within a few yards of where you're sitting now as well. And he was also working in this period. In fact, this year, in 1776, he discovered methane. James Watt establishes a steam engine with a separate condenser that makes steam power basically useful in settings that mean you can move it somewhere other than simply outside a coal mine. So until that point, the only way you'd ever use steam for stuff was just next to a coal mine. So it didn't really do much. But Watt devised an engine that was so much more efficient that it meant you could use steam power in many other settings. And within 30 years, people were building trains. And within 50 years, people were building railways and connecting up the whole of Britain using these things. Your nation decided not to go with the whole train thing very much. Although there's an Amtrak station near here, isn't there? But most of the time, Americans are going, we can live without trains. We've got aeroplanes now. But the rest of us, it was very important development and industrial technology. But at the same time, Arkwright's Mill at Cromford, which is in sort of Midlands in Britain, the opening of the Bridgewater Canal connecting Liverpool and Manchester, which is extremely important so you could get cotton back and forth through the port, and that was very important. And the meeting of the Lunar Society, who you may not have heard of, but they almost, Erasmus Darwin, Charles Darwin's grandfather, and James Watt and Matthew Boulton, Josiah Wedgwood, the potter, who's might have come across Wedgwood pottery, really the first sort of The first guy who came up with almost modern marketing, buy one, get one frees, magazines, celebrity endorsements, Josiah Wedgwood. So it's an extraordinarily important period, and that society start meeting in 1776 as well. So it's a very interesting year for the Industrial Revolution. And I talk about, actually a sidebar, I think telling that story is very important because we generally think about the important developments in history as simply being about ideas, particularly as evangelicals. And that actually often the material factors changing underneath, making new things possible and other things harder, are at least as important in the story we tell about the modern world and why it is as it is. So that chapter on industrialization does that. That is then connected to the next chapter, which is about the wealth of the modern world. And I haven't put a chart on the screen, but I can basically enact the chart of the GDP per person of the human race. It basically looks, if you start in 10,000 BC, it looks like this. 9,000, 8,000, 7,000, 6,000, 5,000, 4,000, 3,000, 2,000, 1,000. Noughts, 1,000, 1,500, 1,600, 1,700, 1,770. And since then, life expectancy has gone from about 30 to 60 or 70, depending where you live, or even 80. The GDP per person has gone from about $400 for most of history to about $500 when Shakespeare was alive, to goodness knows what it is in your country, but certainly a lot more than that. And that we call the Great Enrichment, or we call the Great Divergence, or there's all sorts of economic terms for it. But that development inflected in the middle of the 1770s. There's one historian I've read in some detail looks at these development charts and basically sees the inflection point is in 1773. And it also, as it happens, is the same year that Adam Smith, 1776, wrote The Wealth of Nations, which is the most important textbook in modern economic history. In fact, Adam Smith wrote that book the day after James Watt's steam engine started running in the Bloomfield Colliery. That's a pretty important weekend for the history of the modern world. And you've never heard of it because you're like, no, we're all marching, and the redcoats are coming and all that. But actually, at the same time, these incredible, I think you could argue, and I don't mean to be provocative about it, but I think you could argue that the invention of the steam engine and the wealth of nations, and certainly that enrichment change, is much more important for the conditions of your daily life than the American Revolution. It's certainly more important for my and most other people's on this planet experience. They're all connected in various ways, but I think some of these changes are even more important than the ones that most of us are familiar with. I may not convince you of that, but that's fine. I'm English, I'm allowed to. So then democratic, this is what you know. Of course, the Declaration of Independence, the Battle of Brooklyn, Franklin's diplomatic mission to Paris, which is extremely important at the end of the year because bringing in the French, and this is probably where my English bitterness will come out, but it is, I basically, that line in Hamilton, where the king says, you cheat with the French, now I'm fighting with France and with Spain. You're like, okay, we might have won this war if it was just us against you, but then you got the French involved and it all went wrong. And Washington's Crossing, so Christmas night, that story, which of course many of us would know very, very well, better than I do. But I try and tell that story and the narrative of the year as a whole from an American perspective. And it's incredibly important, the democratic innovation, because in 1775, there were no people on earth that lived in countries purporting to be democratic republics. And now, pretty much everyone on earth lives in one. Even countries that are not democratic at all claim they are. The Democratic Republic of North Korea. Now, we laugh, but actually it shows how deeply embedded this ideal has become, that even countries where no one is remotely democratic still feel the need to play that game because of how significant what happened in this country, and not that very far from here, actually was for shaping the ideals people have. And you probably don't need me to convince you of that. Now the patriotism's coming back, isn't it? After my snarky remark about you only winning because you had the French on your side, now you're going, oh, actually, yeah, no, he does like us after all. It's like, so, and try and tell that story, but actually and try and map its significance, as I said earlier, not only in political terms, but also in the way we think about everything has become democratized. The way families work has become democratized. The way communities, churches, economic institutions, the whole caboodle. Does that translate? Do you have caboodles here? You do, good, okay. I often throw out little anglicisms like that, and then people go, what language are you speaking? And I was like, English. But then, I can't promise it'll always land. Then the post-Christianity bit, and this is, I think in many ways, I think this is probably the most significant, for me, the most significant chapter or most significant story, and it's the one that Glenn and I have drilled into in the podcast. But the story again in 1776, David Hume's Dialogues and Death, as I mentioned, Ben Franklin's edit to the Declaration of Independence, where Jefferson sends him the letter saying, can you make any changes? This is what I'm going to take to the committee. And Franklin makes a number of different edits. Most are pretty trivial, but he crosses out the words sacred and undeniable. We hold these truths to be sacred and undeniable. And Franklin puts a line through it. And you can see the image online. And writes instead, self-evident. And I use that as a parable for what the modern West does in saying these truths, which actually are Christian in their foundation, the dignity of every human person, the idea that the Creator has given us certain rights, those things are actually sacred truths, really. Jefferson was right. They are religious truths. They're based on Christianity. They don't come from natural observance of if you have an evolutionary worldview, for instance, which most modern people do, it just doesn't follow from those premises that all people are endowed by their Creator with rights. And so what Franklin did said, no, these things aren't sacred and undeniable, they're self-evident. And of course, modern people hear that and think it's not quite what it meant in the 18th century, but modern people hear that and think, yeah, obvious to everyone with a brain. Self-evident. You think, what are you talking about? 7 billion of the world's people still don't believe those self-evident truths. Many of the founding fathers didn't believe them in 1760. That's one of the reasons they said, we hold them to be self-evident, because they weren't, in the modern sense of everyone knows it. They're grounded in Christian assumptions about the world, about human beings, about dignity, about charity and love and rights. And if you don't have Christian foundations, you've built a house on a foundation and then taken away the foundation, and you're wondering how long the house will remain before it subsides. And there's obviously modern implications for us there. And I give examples of other rejections of post-Christianity which were more fiery. Ben Franklin, in the end, is not rejecting Christianity. He's just saying we can take it for granted, which of course is the first step to rejecting it. But in France, you have much more dramatic moves afoot. You have Voltaire in this period. You have Denis Diderot and his famous interview, which if you read it, is a very, very strong, clever case against Christianity. David Hume, as I mentioned, one of the best modern arguments against Christianity ever written, again in 1776. All of this happens in this year. You have the Marquis de Sade, who I won't go into here, not a pleasant man, but he really goes a whole stage further even than that and says, I don't just want to keep the foundations, keep the moral fruit of Christianity while rejecting God. I hate God, I hate everything that comes with God, and I want morality to be completely reframed so that actually the strong eat the weak and I can satisfy whatever desires I like. In some ways a forerunner, in some ways of Friedrich Nietzsche, and in some ways of Adolf Hitler or many in the 1930s. And then finally the Romantic Revolution, which is the story of how, again, 1776 is really about 15 to 20 years before Romanticism kicked off properly. But it's an extremely important gathering point for a lot of the most influential thinkers who would set the tone for what Romanticism became. People like Goethe, Klinger, Herder, Lenz in Weimar. Jean-Jacques Rousseau wrote his Reveries of a Solitary Walker in the autumn of 1776. And if you read it, you think, man, this is how people talk in Disney movies. It's remarkable. Now we would say, oh, of course, yeah, you write about yourself, you contemplate things like authenticity, what Rousseau called sincérité de cœur, like truthfulness of your heart, being true to yourself. These people, Goethe, the Sturm und Drang, they wrote this way, they talked this way. They said, Goethe said, I return into myself and I find a world. And actually Herder literally says, you have to be true to yourself. Now you go, that sounds like Toy Story or Frozen or whatever it might be, but these ideas were almost unheard of before this group of people in Germany and in Paris. And I tell the story of Giacomo Casanova, who will be a name many of us will have heard of. Just a lover really, but again, fascinating story of him in 1776. So that's probably my favorite chapter in terms of the story, because I just find these characters so fascinating, even though often you might find them in places a bit abhorrent as well. They're just really compelling people. So that is a summary of what almost all of the book is about. So just pause. Why don't you turn to the person next to you and say, the one of those that sounds the most intriguing to me is X. Or, to be honest, I'm not going to read this book ever because why, right? But just turn to the person next to you and process for about 60 seconds and I'll have a sip of water. But what I want to do now is talk a little bit about the way that the church at the time responded to those developments. Now, I don't think that these individuals were necessarily responding in a conscious way to the developments they were seeing in each case. One or two of them definitely were. Some of these might be faces you know. In fact, let's throw this out there. Can anyone in this room name any of those 6 people or 7 people? Well, I suppose if you include the baby, 8 people, but I very much doubt anyone knows who that is. Anyone want to name any of them? Yes, sir. No. Good guess, but it's not George Whitefield, actually. David Hume. Round of applause for the man in the 8th row, just for being the first person to get it. So David Hume is the, by the way, you know which one he is, right? Rather than just throwing the name out. Yeah, David Hume is the one on the bottom right. So yes, you don't want to get David Hume confused with Olaudah Equiano, who is on the bottom left. They do not look alike at all. And this is basically a way of trying to go through of introduce you to the final 2 chapters in what I'm doing, which is to make two comments about how the church can respond in a post-Christian world. One of the chapters I do is to say, what was the church doing in 1776? What were they leaning into? What were they discovering? What was changing in the church, in the worldwide church, particularly the evangelical church, but not exclusively? And then in the final chapter, I say, now what might those discoveries and practices look like today? And how might they help us reach a post-Christian world, which is as a pastor, preacher, writer, that's my concern, and no doubt ours. So a few people to introduce you. So John Newton, we're up top left. John Newton would be well known as the author of Amazing Grace. Most of us would have sung Newton's, probably all of us in this room have sung at least one of John Newton's hymns, and many of us have sung many of them. And depending on who we are, we might not have realized that they were written by John Newton. How sweet the name of Jesus sounds. Many, many others. So we would know a lot of Newton's, but I think a lot of Newton's best hymns about grace, and Newton was obsessed with grace. Like he mentions grace in his only hymns, which are being written between 1773 and 1778, so right across the middle of this period. John Newton mentions grace more than he mentions God or Jesus or the Spirit. So he is absolutely captivated. Now, that, of course, you might say is unique to John Newton because he had experienced such a paradigmatic journey from slaver, and I mean, he's a dark, dark man, right? You read his pre-Christian past. I mean, this is not, we can sanitize it because, and to be honest, we can sanitize slavery because we don't like thinking about it for obvious reasons, but he is a vile man. And he gets converted and he gets radically changed and then, of course, becomes a prominent abolitionist. But you might therefore say, well, Newton is unusual, and of course he's obsessed with grace because he's so aware of what a bad guy he was. And there's probably some truth in that. But what I found beautiful studying this period is how many other hymn writers are writing about grace, and actually how many of Newton's hymns about grace are ducks better than Amazing Grace. That actually, I think a lot of the things Newton wrote, and some of his quatrains, his poetry about grace, are more arresting and compelling in describing the grace of God even than the most famous one. Actually, in Newton's life, Amazing Grace wasn't the thing he was known for. That it really became popular to the extent it is now after the Second Great Awakening, and particularly for its use in the African American community. But at the time, so I quote lots and lots of examples of not just Newton's hymnody, but many, many others who were writing glorious hymns at this period, like the church has probably never before, and arguably even never quite since, experienced a period of such intensity of hymns that focus on the grace of God transforming the individual. It was a huge, obviously the Wesleys are still writing, they're collating primarily by this age, they're older, but they're writing, a lot of their hymns obviously very focusing on the theme of grace. 1776 was the year that Augustus Toplady wrote Rock of Ages. And that was a lovely story because, again, a very, very powerful hymn about grace, but one that kind of came out of Toplady getting into a squabble with Wesley. If you know the story of it, it doesn't reflect well on either of them, actually. I know that we like our heroes in evangelicalism, but you see the way that they wrote about each other, you think, these guys, this is not going well. It kind of puts Twitter into context, in a sense. Very, very sort of quite virulent and angry, and Toplady in part wrote Rock of Ages to give a bit of a slap to what he understood as the Wesleyan misunderstanding of grace. And if you reread Rock of Ages with those eyes, you'd think, oh yeah, it does. Nothing in my hands I bring, simply to thy cross I cling. Naked come to thee for dress, helpless look to thee for grace. Foul I to the fountain fly, wash me, Savior, or I die. Beautiful lyrics, but in Toplady's context, trying to give a poke to the Wesleyan understanding. But by God's grace, this hymn that Toplady had partly written almost as a polemic turns into a hymn that's such a powerful statement of grace that the Wesleyans all go, yes, that's exactly what we believe, and they all start singing it. And God does that. God does that in controversy, doesn't he? You see the history of God even in they think about the creeds. Or think about so many major developments where you think God meant, you meant this for evil, but God meant it for good. And as a result, now, Rock of Ages is one of those much loved hymns about God's grace, and again, written and published in 1776, along with many others. And I talk about, John Berridge, that's probably, John Berridge is not in this particular year, but he's within a few years he writes, it's my favorite line on explaining the difference between law and grace. Run, John, and work, the law commands, but finds me neither feet nor hands. Better news the gospel brings. Bids me fly and gives me wings. It's just beautiful. And loads of people are writing stuff like that in this period. And there's many, William Cooper, God works in a mysterious way. They're all working in this period. And I love digging into the discovery of grace. And that's where my friend Olaoda Equiano, who's probably the single most interesting book to read from this period, I would say. The Wealth of Nations, History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, lots of great works written in this year. But Olaoda Equiano's interesting narrative of the life of Olaoda Equiano is just astonishing. He's from what would now be sort of Nigeria, Benin, and he gets kidnapped and taken to the West Indies, and then he gets taken and forced to work as a slave, and he gets taken to North America. But eventually he gets converted, he buys his freedom, he becomes an abolitionist, and in 1776 he's traveling to Britain, where he will then settle and become a major influence in the abolitionist movement. And the reason I talk about Olaoda Equiano in the context of grace is because one of the most moving passages you'll read in any book from this period, or any period actually, is Olaoda describing the vileness of the people who he's seen and what they've done on slave ships in gut-wrenching passages. It's horrible to read, but so you read it, you need to see it for what it was, and then talk about worshipping alongside white people in London, and not only being prepared to do that, but also being able to worship God and say, actually, God has given me more than I deserve. And Olaoda's understanding of grace is so deep that even though he's experienced violences we can't even contemplate, he still says the grace of God to me, a sinner, is so profound that God has blessed me more than I deserve. It's just an astonishing. So in other words, it's not just, white men with wigs in Bedfordshire who are talking about grace. It's beginning to take root everywhere in evangelicalism, and that experience of grace is profoundly important in this period. Then if you move along to the sort of middle kind of column, so at the top, that lady is called Rebecca Protten, and the gentleman at the bottom is called Lemuel Haynes, who was the first African-American to be ordained as a pastor. And I tell their stories really through the lens of the left-hand two figures are about grace, the middle figures are about freedom and understanding, because I tell the story of abolitionism, which is probably a bit more familiar here to some degree, and tell the story not just of abolitionism in terms of freedom from slavery, but also religious freedom, which is a story that would be more familiar, again here probably, abolitionism more in Britain. So obviously our journeys on freedom for slaves were very different in our two nations, but then our journeys on religious freedom were inverted. So you guys came to a religious freedom much sooner and came for freedom for slaves later. And the stories are interesting and interwoven, and I try and do that justice in that section and introduce you to some Christian brothers and sisters who might not be so familiar to many of us. And then on the right, we've got David Hume in the bottom right, but I bet there's no one here who knows who the guy in the top right-hand corner is, unless they've already read my book and seen it. He looks like a pirate. If I didn't know who he was, I would not think he was regarded by a Christian Lutheran philosopher who was regarded by Goethe as one of the brightest lights in the land, as regarded by Kierkegaard as one of the two cleverest men who ever lived, along with Socrates. Hegel wrote a review of his monograph. He was a good friend of Immanuel Kant, and then when Kant published The Critique of Pure Reason, this man published a book called The Metacritique of the Purism of Reason, which basically outflanked Kant on his own ground and debunked. And he was influential on the Sturm und Drang. He was influential on Herder. He was, as I said, pretty much any German philosopher you've heard of was profoundly shaped by Hamann. And the only reason we aren't is because he wrote in German. Much of it is only now being translated into English, and he's not known anywhere near as much as he should be. And his name is Johann Georg Hamann. And Hamann, and he's just a mischievous, impish, prank-playing Christian, very Christian German philosopher. And you should know more about him than probably most of us do, unless John Betts is in the room or something. I'm just astonished by this man, because so I've just one little thing. So he's continually arguing against the Enlightenment's desire to separate out reason and faith and saying, in the end, he uses Hume and says, you just can't separate out reason and faith because the things that you believe, and he plays on the fact that belief and faith are ultimately the same thing in Greek and in German, the things that you believe are statements of faith. You actually need faith to believe that the sun will come up tomorrow. There is no logical syllogism that tells you that it will. David Hume, he says, needs faith to boil an egg or drink a glass of water. And actually, one of the biggest mistakes the Enlightenment is introducing into the world, Harman is saying, is the wedge between reason and faith. They're united in language. They're united every time you have a conversation. The words I'm speaking to you now are both physical and immaterial phenomena. Atoms are vibrating, but the ideas that you're thinking about right now, whether they're anything to do with what I'm saying or not, are not reducible to the atoms. They are almost transcending the atoms. Reason and faith are continually being connected in speech, language, conversation, and ultimately in Christ. And you would find it surprising, I expect, to know that German philosophers in the 1770s were talking about the hypostatic union of the natures of Christ as a way of explaining the relationship between reason and faith, and the relationship between word and flesh in philosophy and critiquing the Enlightenment on its own ground. The man is a genius, and he wrote a fantastic, whimsical essay defending the letter H, which is one of my favorite little essays. That you can read because it's not very long, but it's basically almost like a parody of an Enlightenment German rationalist had written an article saying, we need to get rid of H's when they're unpronounced at the end of our surnames or end of our words. And Harman goes, what are you talking about? Your last name is Damm, D-A-M-M. Should we remove the M at the end of your name as well? And maybe what damn is going to be able to resist this orthographic deluge? I've got Harman, I've got two N's at the end of my name. Do we get rid of that? And he says this is a parody of the Enlightenment. That's what they do. They try and make everything rational as if you can remove reason from history, contingency, language, and faith, and you can't. And the Enlightenment's trying, and it doesn't work, and it's a dead end. Anyway. You may not want to read Harman. You may not even want to read Wilson. But if you do, I hope you'll enjoy that bit. He's brilliant, okay? And then, so that's grace, freedom, and truth. And then I'll very quickly just say, in the last chapter, what I try and do is to apply those paradigms of thinking through grace, freedom, and truth into the modern world and apply it in the sense, I use the story of Hamilton, that question, have I done enough? And say, that is the question people in your community are asking, particularly if they're privileged. So have I done enough? How do I know when I've done enough? And some of the sort of faith statements, the Protestantism, as we were talking about in a panel last night actually, are behind statements like this. It takes a lot of courage to be who you are. They're actually for people to find out, how do I find identity? How do I justify my privilege? How do I pursue status in the modern post-Christian West? They need grace. They don't need grace in the same way that the reformers sometimes talked about it. People in my city, in London, are not wandering around going, how do I please a holy God? But they're asking all sorts of other questions to which the answer is grace. And it's important that we see what those are, and that's what I try and do in that chapter. I then talk about freedom and a sort of both and vision of freedom, where freedom is both freedom from external oppression, like slavery, and this is the Hunger Games, people with guns and fences, but also freedom from internal slavery, which if you've seen the Hunger Games, those guys in the Capitol who are sort of just slaves to their passions and their desires. And a Christian vision of freedom involves both external and internal liberation. Anyone who sins, Jesus says in John 8, slave to sin. But if the Son sets you free, you'll be free indeed, both from that stuff and from this stuff. And then finally, a post-Christian response of truth and the importance of truth in a post-truthy kind of age where people talk like that and where some best-selling books that sell 30 million copies will make the case that, it isn't, Christian values are not true, but we have to believe them anyway because if we didn't, we'd become nasty people. And how people live with that dissonance and why it is that as the church, we have really great news for people like that, which is know those things you believe are true, but they're true for reasons you may not have thought about. And this is where Jesus comes in. So that's what I do in the final chapter.